Hello, World History students. This is Mr. A. Welcome back to our final unit on Module 4, pretty much taking us up to modern day 9/11 and talking about globalization and how we all are an interconnected community. So just a reminder for our modules, what you need to do is first listen to this lecture, and then I have a web quest. And then once that, you are done for the year, I believe. I don't think I have anything else planned for you. But this module might be, I think, a little bit, maybe about the same size, but I will say the web quest is a little bit shorter than what I've normally done before. There's a lot of things I could talk about that are very interesting, so that's why I put up a lot of videos on this one, just so you can see different issues or hot button issues in the world. And I said, you guys are now global citizens of the world. One of the reasons why I think history is important is because you have to understand what's going on in the world. And the only way you can understand what's going on in the world is to actually know the world's history. And that's even more true with this unit, I'd say. All right, so these are a bunch of things, supposedly the essential questions that the state of Virginia really wants you guys to know. So a lot of this has to do with independence movements. So if you recall, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Europe took over a lot of Africa and Asia. Well, after World War II, when Europe was pretty much defeated and had a lot of economic troubles themselves, a lot of their former colonies were able to start breaking free and becoming independent. And let's just say a lot of those newly independent countries, it was not a smooth transition. Imagine if you had a territory that was ruled as a colony and used mainly as a way to produce raw goods for Europe, and then all of a sudden you're granted your independence with very little help in between, really. And that's what's kind of resulted into a lot of these countries. Or maybe you are a country, but the lines that make you a country were drawn by European power, not yourself. So the lines of your country don't even make sense to the reality of what's going on the ground. And those are a lot of the issues what's happened with what a lot of those former colonies have had to deal with, even going on to present day. So the first area of concern of this decolonization movement would be in India. So India used to be a British colony, but then after World War II, it was granted its independence. And it used to be what's present-day Pakistan, India, and even Bangladesh, which is a little greenish area on the right side, it's not labeled, was all one colony together, and they actually were supposedly one country together. And they got independence through a guy named Gandhi. Hopefully you've heard of him before. Civil disobedience. We're going to rebel against India. Rebel against England, but we're going to use nonviolence to do it. There's a lot more Indians than there are British people, so as long as Indians basically refuse to help British people run the government, British people won't be able to control it anymore. And so they were able to get their independence. However, there ended up being a huge dividing line in India. There was a Muslim majority and a Hindu majority, and those two religions don't really get along very well. And eventually it became so bad that they ended up having to form different countries. So Pakistan and a small Bangladesh became Muslim countries, whereas India became the Hindu country. And then the question is, what happens if you're on the wrong side? Like, well, if you're a Muslim and you live in India, or you're a Hindu and you live in Pakistan. Well, the answer was you face chances of severe violence, or you basically just had to try to move as best as you could. So it was not a smooth transition, and there's still a lot of tensions, especially between India and Pakistan. And if you look where that white line is on the map, that is the border of Kashmir right now. And Kashmir is a hot button territory that both of those countries claim on, and it's even more scary today because both those countries have nuclear weapons. So if they did end up declaring war on each other, you have two nuclear power countries fighting each other, which is obviously not very good. Luckily that has not happened, but Kashmir is still a disputed territory that's been unsolved. Talking about Indian diplomacy growing up, so I'd say number one thing I want you guys to know is that second one right there. Their constitution prohibited the caste system. So if you remember from the beginning of the year, the caste system was based on reincarnation and whatnot. You got certain roles in society. And if you're at the bottom of the caste system, you were called an untouchable, and basically everyone wants to basically keep away from you. You're so basically polluted that no one wants to get near you. But the caste system was prohibited in the, or at least prohibited from discrimination in the Constitution 1950. That doesn't mean the caste system's gone. It's still alive and well today, but it's supposedly it's gone at this point, I guess I should say. Yeah. What else is going on there? I will say India is probably one of the it is one of the largest populations in the world at this point in time, and it is the largest democracy in the world at this time. And since they are have a majority in, English speakers, a lot of people looking ahead for economic development, we do look to India as one of those emerging markets that we are growing our economy closer and closer to. All right, jumping over to Africa. If you recall, most of Africa was colonized. Ethiopia was really the only one that was not colonized, as well as Sierra Leone, a small colony in Western Africa. But pretty much everyone else in Africa was colonized at one point in time in the 1900s or late 1800s, I believe. After World War II, starting in the 40s, 50s, and accelerating in the 60s, a lot of those former colonies became independent countries again. And let's just say sometimes it was violent, sometimes it was peaceful. The example I'll give you of peace would be in the West, in the small countries in the Western Africa. Violence would probably be more in Kenya and Eastern Africa. And if you look to the Northern Africa, Algeria actually fought a war with France. And if you think about that, Algeria, it's a big country, but most of it's sand. But why did France really care about Algeria so much? And the answer would be oil, all those natural resources. So again, these are just some examples. I already talked about West Africa was generally peaceful. Algeria was war. Kenya was still violence. And then, of course, we have South Africa, which is something I guess I'll talk about very, very briefly. South Africa is famous. They got independence in 1910. However, the minority white population there, which is descendants of European colonists, still ruled South Africa, and their system they used was called apartheid. And apartheid was racial discrimination, similar to Jim Crow here in the United States, where the white minority was separated from the black majority. And that's how South Africa was for most of its history, where the black Africans were treated as second-class citizens. However, in 1990 is when they started officially to end apartheid, and in 1994, Nelson Mandela was the first black president elected in South Africa. And if you're ever looking at Nelson Mandela, he does have an interesting history. He was a civil rights activist, I believe, in the 70s. He got arrested and spent several decades in jail, and then in 1990, he was released from jail, and then he became president only a few years later. And if you're looking for a movie this time of year, I would normally show Invictus. During this time period, I would highly recommend if you want to see a good movie. Invictus is right up there, and it does talk about apartheid, and it's talking about how they're trying to recover as a country after apartheid's finally been disbanded, taken away. Jumping over to the Middle East, if you recall, after World War One, the Middle East, the former Ottoman Empire, is dissolved, and then France and England primarily take over those areas and start ruling them. Technically, they're somewhat independent, but really they're protectorates, so European countries are still ruling them, and they're called protectorates in a way because supposedly what they're saying is these countries are not ready to be independent. There's a lot of racism involved in here where these are white man's burden. Europeans have to teach them how to rule. But I would say an alternative motive, once again, is these areas also do have a lot of oil. So, of course, European countries want oil. And it's only after World War II that a lot of these countries gain independence. And one of those big significant countries that we'll talk about is in Israel. So it used to be there was this territory called Palestine that was a primarily Arab Muslim population. But after World War II, and especially with the realization of the Holocaust, England, which had the mandate of Palestine, worked with the United Nations and gave the Jews Israel, their homeland from biblical times, back to them. And Israel is a Jewish nation. However, they're surrounded by a bunch of Arabs who are Muslims who don't necessarily like them very much, in part because a lot of local Arabs, view the Jews as almost kind of like as conquerors themselves, with Western imperialism helping them gain their territory. And so there was a lot of series of wars. Israel is known for having a lot of wars and a lot of military support from the United States, even through this day, to make sure they maintain an independent country. And if you're paying attention, there still is a lot of conflict between Palestinians and Israelis today over living in that area, because Palestine was, people lived there before the Jews showed up there, and now they have to learn to live with these people that are not Jews, they are Muslims. And a lot of people talk about doing a two-state solution, but if you listen to the webquest, and there's a video on that webquest that talks about how that two-state solution is a lot more complicated than you think it would be. The other country we'll talk very briefly about is in Egypt. A guy named Nasser took over there, and one of the first things he did is nationalize the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal is the canal that made it so if you're in Europe and you're trying to get to India, instead of having to go all the way around Africa, you can just cut through the Suez Canal, and it saves you, several thousand miles of travel. And nationalized basically means the government takes over. So the Suez Canal was a privately owned by an English company, but when Nasser took over, he said the Egyptian government would now rule it, which the British obviously did not like very much, but were unable to stop. All right, so moving ahead to some big challenges, contemporary challenges from the 1990s to early 2000s is we're dealing with, there is still a lot of conflict still going around the world, and there's still a lot of refugees that go around the world, people who have to run away from things. And one of the things, I think I'll put this as an extra video on Teams if you want to do it. There is a conflict, a civil war going on in present-day Syria right now, and a lot of Syrian immigrants have moved to European countries trying to avoid that conflict. And initially, European countries accepted them, especially in Germany. However, there has been a lot of nationalism growing in Europe, in part because of these these Arab refugees coming in there. Think about it. Refugees don't have money, and especially since these are Syrian refugees, they're not culturally Europeans and may not even know how to speak the language of the country they ran away to. So there has been some pushback to these refugees. But as these conflicts do happen around the world, refugees do happen. And I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide, but you can see there's a lot of incidents of nationalism around the world that have happened since the 1990s. In Northern Ireland, it was Catholics were fighting for independence against the Protestant majority in England, and eventually Ireland did become an independent country. Balkans was a country in Eastern Africa. Well, it was actually Yugoslavia, but there's so many different nationalities in there that eventually they split up into like 8 different countries. Horn of Africa, if you ever heard about the Somali pirates, that's them right there. They are what a lot of people consider a failed state. Where they have a government, but the government really doesn't have much control of anything. So there's a lot of piracy that happens there. And the last thing I want to talk on is think about technology and how technology has influenced us today. Even my brief history, when I was growing up, I did not have internet, at least not computer internet. I think I got internet in when I was 8 years old. I didn't get a smartphone until I was in graduate school, after college, and after that. So even for me, the technology change from me to you guys is a very rapid change. And as you guys look at technology, especially right now since I'm doing this over video, just imagine how technology is rapidly changing our society. Here's just a video showing you refugees, and I think the top left is what that used to be like Yugoslavia, at least parts of Yugoslavia. You can see how they have different nationalities in there, which commenced lots of violence. All right, so moving on to just categorizing things. This is a category that I think is going out of fashion. But roughly speaking, we call countries that are a developed country, i.e. wealthy, like Western Europe, maybe like Japan and China and the United States, are developed, economically developed, well off, high education, good economics, population growing at a steady rate, versus developed countries, which would be ones that are obviously poorer countries that have a lot of poverty, poor health, illiteracy, lots of famine, diseases that they don't need a cure. And one of the things that's going on with our global society, especially with free markets going on here, is we have to balance maybe watching out for transnational companies taking advantage of these smaller countries, and of course helping them grow in a safe manner. And there is a lot of conflict against globalization, which we can talk about. If you're paying attention to the news, they're talking about. One of the examples I like talking about that's not necessarily in your curriculum, if you think about it, there's not a lot of factories here in the United States because factory workers in the United States cost more than factory workers like in China would. However, the example I'll give you guys is like the N95 masks that are used by doctors here in the United States. Guess what? There's only one factory in the United States that actually makes it. Most of those masks come from foreign countries in Asia. So one of the concerns we're thinking about with this trade imbalance with these poor countries in the developing world, or in this case, China is not a developing country, it's a more developed country, but still, is how do we balance this free trade with our country's interests? And I'm curious to see that maybe we're going to start seeing a shift in this free market where maybe the United States will be more willing to spend more money on factories that are not maybe as cost efficient, but at the same time, if there is a disruption in the global supply chain and chain of trade routes, we'll still be able to get the essential goods that we need. I know another example they give is what happens if we go to war against a country and all our weapons, military weapons, are made by a foreign country. So then our weapons are dependent on someone else. We're dependent on someone else to actually make our weapons. So we'll see. Maybe in a few years, like 4 or 5 years or so, you'll start noticing more factories might start coming back in the United States. Or who knows? Maybe we'll just ignore this and just keep on doing what we did before the pandemic. All right, these are just showing you the global inequality in the world. So you can see like the largest economies. China is huge for producing things. India is huge for producing things. Whereas you can see in Africa is relatively undeveloped countries that they are still trying to grow. This is kind of tying into that what I was talking about before, the economic interdependence, us being dependent on other countries. So it's slowly getting rid of those international boundaries, where like Apple, Google, Pepsi, Starbucks. All these things can be maybe founded in one country, but then have headquarters all over the world. Like, McDonald's are all over the world. McDonald's are in China, McDonald's in India. So the idea of national boundaries is kind of starting to fade away. At least that's what people were thinking in their early 2000s, where eventually, who knows, we'll just have these big global organizations like the European Union, United Nations. And of course, they talk about these trade agreements that are trying to eliminate trade barriers between countries. And I think that was very much true, and it was a goal that we were searching for most of the 2000s. However, I think there has been some pushback to that, especially now with this coronavirus happening. So I think generally speaking, we are still moving in this direction. However, I could say there's one step, 2 steps forward, 1 step back in that progress thing going on, and I think that's what's happening. And here's just a little map just showing you the interconnectivity of the world, where all these companies, maybe they're American based, but they're all over the world, or maybe it's a foreign country that started coming here. Like an example of a foreign country I'll give you guys right now is TikTok. I think a lot of you guys use TikTok, but guess what? It is made in China. So that's a Chinese company that you are supporting. And here's a little map just showing, this is a very popular map that Americans like talking about. Starbucks was first started, I believe, in Washington, the state of Washington, but of course now it's headquartered all over the world. And you can see right there, it's starting to earn even more money. It's not there yet, but it's starting to earn more money in China than it does in the United States. And of course, you see McDonald's, once again, it was an American company, but they're starting to grow rapidly around the world, especially you can see in Europe and in East Asia. All right, the last thing we'll talk about, content knowledge. A big issue in the world is terrorism. So obviously the biggest terrorist attack was 9/11, which has shaped pretty much all your lives. The idea that we have to deal with these terrorist attacks, because easier transportation, easier communication can also make it easier for terrorists to do things. And like I said, we got involved in the Middle East in part because of terrorism, and we are still involved there today. Car bombings was mostly done by Northern Ireland as a way of protesting. And the Munich Olympics was when a bunch of Jewish athletes were actually killed, being anti-Semitism going on there. So it was an example of a terrorism against Jews in that case. So how do we respond to this terrorism? And the answer there is something that we're still debating with today. Like, how much freedoms are we willing to give up for safety? Or are we willing to accept surveillance of the state, of the country, and giving rid of some of our privacy in return to feel more safe? And if you look right here, like the best example of 9/11 is it used to be pre-9/11, people could wander through the airports and there really wasn't that much security screening. But now there is a lot more security screening where they literally scan your body to make sure you're not bringing in weapons. And if you're thinking about this is more modern day, like really modern right now, one of the conflicts happening right now is, and this is not terrorism, but for this virus going around, the COVID-19, is they want to do contact tracing, which basically is try to track who had the disease and who did they come in contact with, so then we can try to quarantine the people they came in contact with. The only way you can know that really, what some countries are doing, is they're actually tracking our cell phone movement. They haven't done it yet in a lot of, not here in Virginia, but it's starting to happen, I think, in some states. And there is a lot of privacy issues there where now you have the government monitoring your every movement, at least with your cell phone movement. And it is that, that feels kind of weird, Big Brother watching out for you. But at the same time, the argument for doing that is for the safety, so they can track the movement of the disease and stop it from spreading. And I'll be very curious. I know a lot of East Asian countries are more willing and accepting, and they are doing it. But I know in America we value freedom, and I don't think that will fly. But I guess that we'll see. We'll keep track of it. It's in the news, and I'm sure you guys will encounter it sometime soon, or at least the debate of it sometime soon. All right, so that is it for my lecture. Before I go on to talking about the web quest, I just want to say congratulations on making it through World History 2 this year. I know this year has been a challenge with a fire, and then, of course, this Corona-19 pandemic going on here. I've had a wonderful time being you guys' teacher, and I wish you guys all the best. And I hope I see you guys again in the fall. Just a reminder, now that you're done this lecture, please check out the web quest. Go through that web quest and make sure you hit submit at the end. And once you finish that web quest, I think you guys are done for the year. Like I said, have a good summer.